Welcome to the Insurgent Mindset. I'm Matt Tice.
I'm Rondo Moses. Hey, Matt.
Good to see you, Rondo. Looking forward to today's session. We're going to be exploring an area of particular passion for both of us, the insurgent mindset in not-for-profits, associations, NGOs, etc. So I'm thinking this will be a great one.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. I have, I think, a good point of view that I'd like to share around nonprofit organizations. I know you've done a lot of work with nonprofits and associations, so looking forward to the conversation.
So, Rondo, why don't you start by just giving us a little bit of your sort of resume for not-for-profits? I know that you're on a board of at least one, so give us a little bit of your background and exposure to not-for-profit.
Yeah, I'm on the board of a charter management network organization with operations in New York, New Jersey, and in Boston. We manage the schools, like something like 55 schools we have, which cover 20,000 students in low-income communities. And our schools are really focused on closing the achievement gap and helping our students get to and go through college. I'm also a former board member of a smaller, and that organization is a pretty sizable organization, have about a $500,000 operating budget for that organization. And then I was also, as of up until this past January, I was on the board of a smaller nonprofit organization that was focused on helping people with personal transformation and developing the life skills that they need to overcome obstacles and challenges. And I was on that board for probably 4 or 5 years. I've been on the education board for the last 15 years.
Okay, that's quite a spread. So that'll give you different perspectives to large, small, kind of different models and things like that, which is terrific. And for my part, I'm currently a director and the board chair for ADHD Australia, which is a national charity. And I'm also an advisory board member of a company called Resilient Ready, which is a social enterprise, not-for-profit model. And in our work, we do probably a little bit less than a third of our consulting work in our main company is focused on, not-for-profits, associations, NGOs, and so forth. So we get a chance to work with lots of different companies struggling with the challenges of the modern era. So I think it'll be interesting. So Rondo, in your experience, let's sort of set the table. The insurgent mindset for the not-for-profit leader. That's going to be our frame for today. How
Mhm.
would you sort of characterize some of the challenges that not-for-profit leadership has in this current highly dynamic, disruptive environment?
I think not-for-profit leaders, and again, speaking from my experience working with the two organizations I mentioned and a few others in a consulting capacity, is that these organizations are naturally mission driven. So they naturally have a built-in target audience. And I think the tendency for some of these organizations is over time to get complacent, and because they're so focused on that target audience, they fail to see some of the changes that are maybe happening in the external environment that may be shifting who would most benefit from their services or find new opportunities to serve a different audience or target base. I think that's one of the challenges. I think another big challenge that I'm seeing with nonprofits is their adoption of technology. I would say that they've been very manually focused, and automation is new to them. AI is head spinning for them. And so I think just them trying to get comfortable with technology and the thought of digital transformation is also a big challenge. And then the third thing I would say is around funding sources, because in challenging economic times, donors are really being very, I would say, stringent about how they decide where they're going to place their dollars and where they're going to give them who they're going to give their money to. And there are a lot of organizations competing for the same dollar of philanthropy. And so again, thinking a little bit differently about one, how they develop relationships with donors, how they source funds, and in creating a I would say a development process that allows them to create more sustainable relationships with donors, not just when they're asking for money, but throughout the year is also, I think, something that nonprofit organizations who want to be successful are really thinking about.
Okay. I'll pick up on your last one. I think what you're really saying is that, a combination of a very tight funding environment aligned with the need to kind of keep funding quite diversified in these organizations
Absolutely.
is a bit of a crisis for some. I think that, in the observing the work that we do in the consulting business, I think a lot of times we'll find ourselves working with not-for-profits or associations that have had that problem. It's been a chronic problem for a period of time where funding is drying up, or something significant has changed in the environment, and consequently that not-for-profit business model, which may have been created, in some cases 100 or 50 years ago, and largely hadn't changed, to your earlier point, find themselves in a situation where that business model needs to be rebooted and discover a new way to get funding or to get to market or whatever. I think it's very interesting. So I would say in this environment right now, particularly where, I guess the downstream consequences of the USAID decision will flow through this whole sector, even globally, because there's whatever $42 billion worth of funding that will go away and need to be replaced, more or less across the board. So we'll see how that plays out. But I think we're in a situation where this funding challenge will be more significant going forward than perhaps it was even just yesterday. So that's something I really worry about for not-for-profits. And then the other thing you said, which I'd like to pick up on too, is the mission-driven point. I think it's a feature, not a bug for the most part, but
Hmm.
I think the challenge obviously is to kind of get that commercial and mission balance right. It's how do we make sure that we have steadfast focus on the mission and that the majority of our resources are fundamentally going to the beneficiaries of that mission, but at the same time, how do we manage commercially? And I think in for-profit companies, the kind of the loop between the company, the competition, and the customer plays a really strong role in kind of checking leadership. So in other
Hmm.
words, decisions that get made get tested by the customer. Is the customer going to buy it or not? They vote with their feet. And certainly the competition gets a vote too. So you're always in that dynamic where you have to change all the time to adapt to those needs. Whereas I feel in not-for-profits, while many not-for-profits are exposed to that dynamic for sure, the competition is more for resources upstream for many. As you pointed out, it's the competition for funding as compared to the competition for eyeballs or beneficiaries of the mission. So consequently, I think that leaders don't get that kind of highly dynamic kind of environment to learn how to adjust and pivot and deploy resources differently. And if I
Yeah.
add one more thing, is the other C is the capital is is less available for most not-for-profits or harder to get. And therefore, when capital is constrained, the leadership's relationship with risk becomes very risk averse. So therefore, not-for-profits don't tend to take risk, try new things, implement new systems, whatever it might be, which then creates a situation where they move relatively slowly, perhaps in an environment that's moving more quickly. So I think all these things kind of come together where leaders have to find that commercial balance. They have to learn how to take more measured risks. They have to learn how to expose themselves to the market more. And then they have to learn how to build teams that can kind of, create, deal with these dynamics and, adjust and reshape their business models as times change.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because the personal transformation, I'll call it nonprofit, where I worked on the board, their big challenge was that their traditional model was more of a university type model around this methodology, this personal transformation methodology. And so it was getting people to commit to a 2 year or 4 year program. And what they found is that they were getting sort of fewer and fewer, or harder and harder to attract people to that model. And one of the things that we as new board members, when I joined 4 years ago, came in and tried to do was help them to think differently about where they should be going for potential students and opportunities, which is, can you create a digital platform, digital capability around your program, personal transformation program, giving people experiences so that they can join or experience the work, and then maybe at a later date, they will actually decide that they want to go through this certification program and actually be a practitioner of the methodology. So it was sort of like a step up to actually making a larger commitment to being a part of the program. And that was different. One, the idea of putting this kind of a work, doing it virtually, because the work is heavily touch and body involved, because it's a body somatic therapy type approach.
Mhm.
And so doing it virtually created some challenges for practitioners who've been in the space for a long time, sort of getting their headset around, wow, could we do this virtually? How would we do it? And then also, I think, it was just the whole concept of doing something digital and online versus in physically being together, because it was also the program was built around community. And how can we really build that community if we're not, in the same space? And so that was a challenge, but they have continued to, I think, slowly leverage that kind of a new platform. But the traditional platform is still the guiding platform in the organization. But they recognize that they got to continue to reach out, because this virtual platform allows them to work with potential customers who are not in the US, who are not in their local market. So that creates opportunity. And the other big challenge for them too was they really never did a lot of marketing. They never had to market it, because it was word of mouth through practitioners that they found new potential students for their courses. And so that was also different for them.
Okay. Right. So, lots happening there and lots of change. But I think that's the typical story of what we did worked really well until it didn't. And then the
Until it
question
didn't.
is, how do I get the funding to make the change? How do I encourage what may be a hybrid organization of paid and volunteer staff to change? How do I, get investment? There's a whole bunch of things to think about in these environments. But then you mentioned sort of the digital challenge, I think is interesting too. I think one of the things I've observed with many or even most, I don't want to quite say all, but virtually all of the not-for-profits that I've been associated or work with is this sort of zero-sum mindset. What I mean by the zero-sum mindset is sort of this idea, no money, no mission. And I think the most creative not-for-profits that I've come across are ones that are able to think differently about how to get to market, how to engage
Mhm.
their communities. And that might, in your example, that's sort of leveraging platform technology, for example. Let's do that differently. Before we used to do it by word of mouth. Let's figure out how we can scale and create impact in a different way. Or even on the supply side, I know in the charity that I'm associated with, you know, we had um, we had kind of a big breakthrough when we sort of decided that, if we're constrained on funding, maybe we're not constrained on resources. So the idea of, how do you break through those constraints? And, in order to get across our big challenge of, growing impact, we, looked to find alternative sources of, say, volunteers and new capability that we could bring into the organization that we might otherwise have had to pay for. But we found that to be very successful. But I think it's really getting trapped in that mindset that it's zero sum. If I don't have the money, I can't achieve the mission. And I think
Hmm.
that breaking that mindset's really helpful because you discover territory. How do I engage differently on the supply side, for example, like I just said with the volunteers? How do I leverage, for example, public-private partnerships? So are there ways to get private industry involved so that we can, expand the scope of the mission and bring funding in? Groups like Habitat for Humanity do a great job of that, where they're out there in the community achieving the mission, but they work hand in hand with builders and construction materials companies and tool companies and things like that to kind of create an opportunity to build a big flywheel where the public funding and the private funding are kind of working together to expand the mission. So I think that's really important. And then maybe in the last 10 years, these social enterprise models have really sort of exploded in not-for-profit world where these not-for-profits are more and more exposing themselves to the commercial environment, offering a service or a product that has inherent value to the community for a fee, which then gets pushed back into the mission. So I guess it's that quasi-commercial model, which I think is really effective. So look, I think the interesting thing is that there is a lot of innovation in emerging business models and not-for-profits, but I think the insurgent mindset is not to seek these, not to take the risk, and not to build the teams that are really capable of kind of bringing this thinking into their not-for-profits. So I think it's almost an imperative for the leader in the not-for-profit to be really opening up their thinking about these things.
Yeah, when you mentioned the evolution of the mission. So when the charter management organization that I work with started, we're really focused on, starting and managing these public charter schools. And so we're limited to the students within our buildings. But since then, there's been, I would say over the last 15 years or so, a real push to say we have to have an impact beyond our walls. So a number of our key thought leaders, educators have written books. They've conducted trainings around they've codified first our best practices and then conducted trainings for local district educators around some of our best practices because they've been proven to deliver results in terms of closing the achievement gap. So thinking about being able to deliver our best practices to other educators who serve other students and can having an impact that way is also, I think, a different way of thinking about how you achieve the mission, which was different for us.
Sure, and that's an interesting point, Rondo. I think that's if I could generalize that, maybe tell me if I understand this correctly. That's more about looking at a set of capabilities that have been developed over a period of time, and then understanding how those capabilities can create value, and then discovering new pathways for those capabilities to get to market. I think that's very clever in terms of, I don't think most not-for-profits think about their businesses that way as collections of capabilities. Like I said before, some not-for-profits have been around for, a century or more. Certainly a lot of the faith-based ones, and they build these capabilities up over time, which have inherent value, but are almost invisible because those capabilities are only applied to the mission, but
Mhm.
not considered in a, more commercial way. How do we leverage these capabilities? I love that.
Yeah.
That's very
In
interesting.
our case, I think it's just thinking of our audience beyond just our students in our buildings, right? Where we really want to touch low-income students wherever they are. And so whether that is because their educator attended one of our trainings or they were able to access some of our best practices online, we're sharing what we know works with others, and that's sort of expanding the impact.
Okay. Let's shift gears a little bit. I'd love to hear your thoughts as a director and a board member. What's the role of the board in supporting the leadership team with sort of the insurgent mindset? How can the board play that role to generate, you know, interest, excitement, fresh eyes, challenge, overcome the risk barrier that we talked about before? What's the role of the board, Rondo?
Yeah, I
What?
think that's a great question. And it's in fact, we just had a board meeting today. I think that what our board with the Charter and Management Organization does well is ask the executive team tough questions about, particularly around the strategy. So we're in the process now, the executive team is of developing a new strategy for the next 5 years. And so the board's role is really to challenge some of the assumptions behind the strategy and make sure that the organization is really driving change and that we're not just focused on doing things the way we've always done them. And so looking for what's going to be different about the organization or our level of performance when we've been successful at executing this strategy. And I think that that's the role of the board is to keep pushing and asking those tough questions about what's different. And we've been doing that. In the
Mm.
smaller organization where I was on the board, I think the board was a lot more hands-on because it was a small organization similar to the organization that you're on the board, or chair of the board of. It was a volunteer organization as well. So we have a very small team of dedicated resources there. So they needed the board to be more hands-on. We had committees around marketing and curriculum development, things like that. So it was a lot more hands-on, and they really needed the board to support some of the operational things that were going on as well. I think it just depends on what that management team needs. The charter management organization, what they really need is input. They need an outside perspective. They need to be challenged, and then they go and they take it away and do it. The smaller one, it was, hey, we really need someone to develop this particular program for us, support our fundraising efforts, et cetera. So I think it just depends on the organization and what their needs are at the time.
Okay. I think that speaks to a really important thing that I've observed, which is, so you mentioned the scale and the size, obviously the role of the board might be very different. For very small not-for-profits, it's super typical for boards to be working boards where they're rolling up their sleeves and getting involved in the organization. As you get bigger, obviously, that you have more scope to put the board in its usual role. But I think the thing that I've observed the most is that for not-for-profit boards, they tend to be much more people focused on the mission and perhaps less diverse in terms of the capability set that the organization needs to navigate whatever
Mm.
change is surrounding them. So it's that board selection of how do you make sure that you've got the right mix and diversity of opinion, diversity of skill sets, and other elements of diversity to help navigate all these challenges. I see often that not-for-profit and certainly association boards that are related to where the board members are elected from a pool of membership become very homogenous potentially,
Mhm.
and consequently have less flexibility to be able to adapt to change. So I think that's really important, is to be able to allow your board to build a very diverse skill set, which has that balance of commercial and mission in a way that that's very deliberate. And I agree with your point in terms of the role of the board to find a meaningful way to support the team on the ground to do the work, and for sure, especially for not-for-profits, it's that inversion of the board's role to support the mission and the business to achieve its goals, as compared to what you see more often, particularly in listed companies, where the leadership team seems to have a mindset more of supporting the board, right? Everything flows up. So I
Right.
think, it's that mindset of how do you flip that upside down? It's like, how can we support everyone else in this organization to do what we need to do efficiently? This is, again, a completely different mindset.
And to your
One of
point
the
about
things
the
I
skill
thought
set, I think it's important, that speaks to board governance. So if
it
you have a
does.
governance committee, one of the key roles is for that governance committee working with the executive team to really define, to your point, the skill set and capabilities that the board needs at any given time. So for example, we just had that similar conversation today around,
Yeah.
we're looking for new board members. Here are the key capabilities that we're most interested in. That's important. And I would say on at least an annual basis, the board should be doing an assessment of what are our skill sets today? What do we need going forward? And trying to find new board members who can bring a fresh thinking, different perspectives to the board who possess those capabilities.
Right. And then I think the other thing in that is the board's role in terms of supporting leadership team to build these diverse capabilities too, right? Um, it usually, I guess, where the blind spot for most not-for-profits tends to be is where those capability gaps meet the market. In other words, if you're not endowed with the capabilities required to adapt to the change surrounding your business, whether that be a fundraising one or whether that be, your constituents are going somewhere else or whatever the challenge might be, if you're not, or technology to your earlier point, if you're not building those capabilities on the board and in the team, you're going to have blind spots. You're not going to be able to address that.
Yeah.
Now, coming back to my earlier point about risk and boards, the other thing I really have observed is that not-for-profit boards tend to be great at micro risks, things that are right in front of their face, privacy or cybersecurity, whatever those things might be, but not as good perhaps as their commercial brethren in, understanding these kind of tectonic risks, the ones that are, potentially going to put their mission at risk or undermine their existing models. So you mentioned AI earlier.
Hmm.
We're seeing across the economy how goods are delivered, how capabilities are expressed, how organizations interact with the market and with themselves. All these things are changing really across the whole value chain. And it's slower for not-for-profits to pick up on these capabilities and to experiment with them. What advice would you give, or in your experience with the boards that you're on, what advice would you give the leader of a not-for-profit in terms of how to embrace or engage with some of this technology to help them, redefine how value or impact is created in their organizations?
Well, in the case of the charter management organization, we had this conversation today around technology and the role that, AI is going to play as a part of our strategy going forward. And again, I think a big part of getting sort of traction or interest in technology and advances in technology should comes from the board. It comes from that external perspective, but the management team then adopting that, or at least looking into it, because again, the board is there to plant the seeds and to say, have you thought about how technology can support your efficiency goals, for example, the effectiveness goals, and what are we doing to drive innovation? I mean, one of the executive team members today said to me, Rondo, yeah, you asked about that the last time. How are we thinking about AI in the context of all of our other, innovation or R&D efforts? We're working on it. I think that that's what the role of the board is to really get them thinking about that, because most of these nonprofit organizations, to your point, they are heads down dealing with the day-to-day operational stuff. The management of schools is a very complex operation. And so they're really focused on that. And I think they look forward to the board conversations because we help to pull them out of that and force them to think about some of these external issues that might have an impact on the way they work or their target audience, in our case, scholars and students and families. And so that bringing an external perspective, I think, is what really helps to put it, I would say, front and center in their minds.
But that external perspective isn't just the board. I think it's the insurgent mindset for the not-for-profit is to learn to look from the outside in, right? What
But you
can
have to have
we
a process to do that.
That's true. That is true. Let's flip it upside down. We talked about the board. Let's talk a little bit about the workforce. Because to your point about, head down, delivering, and of course, obviously in not-for-profits and associations, NGOs, et cetera, people are very mission driven. They're very focused on the mission. They're there because of the mission, not because they're getting paid a lot. We could have another conversation about incentives, but certainly that's the default. And when a big change comes, uh, the workforce is often really unprepared for that change. So, the change management dynamic in not-for-profits is often much more difficult than potentially they would be in a commercial organization where, maybe you have higher turnover, you have a more commercial mindset where things are going to ebb and flow, but that sort of ossification of how we deliver that mission can become very concreted
Mhm.
in not-for-profits, and therefore difficult, even if you know what to do to motivate the workforce to change their practices, their processes, their engagements, how they speak to their beneficiaries, whatever that might be. It's difficult. So I think let's unpack that a little bit and just understand what advice can we give to leaders to help their workforces become more resilient to change.
Yeah. I think if I use the personal transformation nonprofit as an example, the idea of moving away from just classroom training and education to considering online delivery of these capabilities was a big shift, big cultural shift. A lot of, I would say, resistance initially. But the pandemic, so there was some early attempts to do it even before the pandemic happened that were very slow and not a lot, but the pandemic forced the organization to have to deliver in some cases that way. And people accepted it because they wanted to make sure that the organization was sustainable and was able to get through the pandemic. But then after the pandemic, there was a natural inclination to want to move back to the way things were before the
Mm,
pandemic. And I
right.
think that that's really where the resistance really showed up because people said, hey, the essence of the work is to be in community and to be in the same space and touch. How can we make that, is that can't be sustainable online? And so I think the organization, like I said, I haven't been a part of the board for about a year now, but I think the organization is still trying to find that balance. They still have that traditional classroom approach, but they're also creating more innovative programs for people who may just want an experience. They don't need the certification. They just want to attend an experience and they're willing to pay for that. And so they're creating virtual programs to attract those kinds of customers. And I think that's important for them because, as I mentioned, they were dealing with a shrinking market because all of their leads and opportunities came from existing practitioners. So over time, that population sort of, falls. And so they needed to
Mm,
find new sources for revenue. And this online platform became that new source. And I think they're still working out, they're still learning
yep.
how to use it effectively, market it effectively. Because also that involves social media marketing, which was new to them as
Right.
well. So it's all new capabilities that they're trying to build into the organization.
I think one thing I've observed more and more in not-for-profits that we've worked with is, and this started maybe 25 years ago in the commercial sector, but more and more not-for-profits are creating subsidiary companies, either other not-for-profits or commercial entities to experiment and learn, to try things without necessarily, kind of almost parallel to your point, without kind of interfering with the historical core mission. In other
Hmm.
words, giving themselves license and permission to play on the edges without interfering with, the core. And I think that's really interesting to see now. This is becoming more and more prevalent in, particularly here in Australia. We're seeing a lot more of this. But again, the leadership challenge is the same, is, you have to give these organizations, and you have to give the people in them oxygen to experiment, to try things, to fail even if need be. And I don't think that these techniques that largely came out of Silicon Valley have found themselves really deeply embedded in not-for-profits, but more and more not-for-profit boards are sort of infused with with people with these skill sets like us or others who, can see the benefits of bringing these commercial capabilities into and mindsets into these not-for-profits. So I
Yeah,
think,
I think one other thing I would just add from in terms of the charter management organization, I think one way that they've been doing it is they've been bringing, for example, on the leadership team, they've been bringing in people who are outside of the education space, people who've come from corporate America and put them on the leadership team. So they're bringing in a fresh perspective, outside perspective into the organization.
perfect, exactly. So I guess just summarizing our conversation, and then we'll wrap up, Rondo. I think, there's getting the role of the board really right and getting that skill set's really important. I think creating an environment where the organization has the ability to take risk and apply resources against that risk. I think that's really important. I think the notion of getting out of the zero-sum mindset to find alternative sources of dollars or resources,
Hmm.
diversification that are also really important. I think the change management challenge, of getting the workforce motivated is something that everyone needs to think about. And then I think ultimately the insurgent mindset requires interrogation into alternative business models that allow you to, compete for resources in a different way. So it'll be interesting to hear what our community has to say about the podcast. And let's wrap up here, Rondo. But I look forward to exploring this topic further downstream a bit.
Love the conversation and look forward to further exploring it.
All right. Thanks, Rondo. Have a good afternoon.
All right, Matt.
All the best.